Okay, hello and welcome to this lesson on exam practice for the Germany AQA 8 marker. Now, there are two 8 marker questions in AQA GCSE History. We are looking at the trickiest one of them today, which is the question about how convincing two different interpretations are about a particular topic. So I'll refer to that here on out as the convincing question. So for today's lesson, you'll want to get the following keywords down. First one is convincing. Now, obviously, we do all know that word from our normal conversations, but AQA defines it in quite a specific way as meaning accurate to the facts that you know. So this is nothing to do with who wrote the interpretation, the provenance, or bias. Now, that's something that's probably the most common student error on this question that all teachers and all examiners see. And it is the central takeaway point of this lesson is not to mention that and to stick to only your own knowledge and the facts that you know about the question at hand. So your other keywords then, I wouldn't normally do this in a keyword box, but I am going to do it for this lesson because I think it's really important. The other keywords are ones to avoid discussing. So you want to avoid discussing the word reliable or reliability. That means how trustworthy the author is. We shouldn't be talking about how trustworthy the author is because we shouldn't be talking about the author at all for this question. We should only be talking about the facts that we know and how well they match up to the viewpoint given in the interpretation. We should also avoid discussing all provenance. So who wrote it, when they wrote it, what purpose they had in writing it. None of that is relevant for this question because this question is only about the facts and how well they match to the viewpoint. And finally, bias. This is something that students love to bring in. Bias means hidden preferences that make a person think a certain way. You might well be correct about the author's biases, but because they're to do with the author, they're not relevant for this question. So I am going to sound like a broken record by the end of this lesson. It will be very boring hearing me saying don't talk about the bias by the end of the lesson, but hopefully it will go into your brain that way and you'll remember not to in the exam and you'll be able to get the high marks on this question. So just before we start, this lesson is going to be really relevant to anyone doing GCSE AQA history, and in particular people that are doing the Germany 1890 to 1945 unit, because that's the examples that I'm going to use when I'm modelling this. However, it will be relevant for anyone taking AQA GCSE history. You'll just be doing another unit with the same question styles. So let's get into it. The destination for today's lesson, nice and straightforward. How do I get 8 out of 8 on the Germany 8 mark convincing question? So you may be feeling that it's not possible for you to get 8 out of 8 because that's 100% and this is the hardest question style and it's just impossible. I urge you to not take that attitude. The exams really are like a recipe or a formula. They're looking for the same set of things every time. And if you can just internalize what they're looking for, if you can learn it so it's totally automatic, like tying your shoelaces or brushing your teeth, then it is perfectly possible to get out 8 out of 8 and get those really high grades. You just churn back out almost robotically the same precise way of answering these questions each time. And then beyond that, all it's down to is your knowledge revision, making sure you've got your fact base in place so that you know about the specifics of what they're asking about. But the technique is the same every time. Second thing we're going to try and do by the end of the lesson is understand how the word convincing is different to the word reliable when we are looking at interpretations. So just a reminder, we want to avoid discussing reliability on the 8 marker convincing question. We want to only look at convincingness, and hopefully that will be nice and clear by the time that we get to the end of this lesson. So a quick reminder of what the overall exam questions are for the Germany unit. Question 1 asks you how two different interpretations differ, A and B differ about blank. So that's any subtopic from Germany 1890 to 1945. It's just a what's the difference question. Question 2 asks you why might the authors of interpretation A and B differ about blank? So why would the authors not have the same view? Question 2 is where you would talk about provenance and reliability and potentially bias. You don't talk about it in question 3, which we're looking at today, which is which interpretation is most convincing, the 8 marker. Question 4, nice and simple one, asks you just to describe 2 problems affecting blank. So again, another subtopic. Explain how the lives of blank were affected by blank. That should be an 8 marker. There's a little spag error for you to spot. Again, that's quite a straightforward one. And then question 6, there's another tutorial for this one on Satchel. Which reason was the most important for blank, the 12 marker? Although the 12 marker is where you can get the most marks in the test, it's actually one of the more straightforward ones. The one we're doing today, which interpretation is most convincing, is by far the thorniest in my experience. So if you can crack this one, you're in a really good spot. Okay, so just a quick look at the sentence stems for this question. You can pretty much finish these sentence stems off each time you write an answer to one of these questions, and you're going to be very likely to hit the high marks for it. So let's have a look at what they are. Interpretation A suggests, so you're going to need to just briefly restate what the interpretation is saying overall. You don't need to quote from it or extensively go into it. You just need to say what it's saying in general. Then you're going to say, from my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because. So what this is doing is cueing you to remember that you need to bring in knowledge and not talk about provenance. And it's also going back to the language of the question, which examiners love to see. I can see that this is convincing because. Then you're going to repeat that process with interpretation B. So interpretation B suggests, restate what it says. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because, and then you bring in your facts. Overall, interpretation blank is more convincing about blank because. Interpretation blank is less convincing about blank because. So in the last paragraph, in the conclusion, you will talk about which of the two interpretations is more convincing. And this is the only stage where it's advisable to talk about why one is less convincing. You want to stick to the positives through most of your answer. And then in the conclusion, you say why one has got the edge over the other. So before we start, some general guidelines for the question. You want to take about 10 minutes on this. That's about the right amount of time for an 8-marker question in this paper. You want to do 3 paragraphs, and we'll look at the structure of those in more detail in a minute. You should plan your answer first, so bullet point down the key facts that you know about the subtopic that's being asked about, so that your answer stays coherent and logical and tight, and you don't start waffling. You should use subject-specific vocabulary and formal language. So if you say that the Germans thought the Treaty of Versailles was rubbish, you're not wrong. They did think it was rubbish, but you should be using formal language and subject-specific vocabulary. So if you say the Germans resented the reparations payments they were forced to pay, then that is more formal and more subject-specific. It's not just a posher way of saying the same thing. It might well seem like that, and sometimes formal language really is just a posher way of saying the same thing. But in history, it's often a way of more precisely making your point. So saying there was resentment really means that kind of lingering sense of bitterness that the Germans felt about the Treaty of Versailles, and saying reparations payments is a nice specific clause that they specifically did not like. All right, so we're going to start out with a football example, so not a historical example. We're going to put history to one side for a moment, and we're just going to focus on the mechanics of the question with a non-historical football example. So let's have a look. Interpretation A is from me, Mr. Richardson, and it says Liverpool were the best team in the league, and they'll definitely win the league this year, and I adore them. Interpretation B from my colleague, Mr. Moore, says Liverpool were hilarious tonight. They were useless. They got no chance of winning the league. I love seeing them fail. And that was right after Liverpool lost 4-1 to Man City. So the question here is, which interpretation is the most accurate? You may find it convincing. You may find it useful, to cross out the word convincing and replace it with the word accurate. Because the word accurate is perhaps more precise and will cue the right kind of answer from you. Accurate means, is it true? It doesn't mean, is the author likely to be fair? It means, does it match the facts? Is it true? Second thing, what facts do you know that could match up to each of these interpretations? And what should you avoid talking about? So have a little think. If you're not a football fan, don't worry about the first 2 questions. You don't need to know any facts about football for this, really. It's just going to be a demonstration. But do think about, what should you not do? what's the most common student error that I've mentioned a few times already that is commonly made in these exams? What are you going to avoid? Pause the video here, write it down. Okay, so if you said, I'm going to avoid talking about the provenance, the reliability, and the bias, then you're absolutely right. You don't want to mention my name or Mr. Moore's name, or our biases, or our trustworthiness at all in any way when you answer this question. It's just how well do our different viewpoints that Liverpool are good or that Liverpool are bad match up with our knowledge about the reality of what's going on. So let's have a look at how this would look. We would structure it in the following way. Paragraph 1 would be ways that interpretation A can be considered convincing. Note there that we're sticking to the positives. I'm not talking about ways it isn't convincing or is less convincing. Then we're going to think about the same process for interpretation B. In what ways can that one be considered convincing? And number 3, our final paragraph, the conclusion, is going to say which is most convincing overall. That's the only point really where you want to say where one gets the edge over the other based on the facts. Again, pause the video. What are we not going to mention on pain of death for this exam answer? If you said bias, reliability, or provenance, then you're absolutely right. They would get no marks. You might be completely correct. You might say, well, look, Mr. Richardson is a Liverpool fan. Of course, he's going to be positive about Liverpool. He's biased. And that's true. I am biased about Liverpool. But it's not relevant to this question because this question is asking about convincingness, not about reliability. So you're going to talk about how accurate my interpretation is and how accurate Mr. Moore's interpretation is, not how biased or unbiased we might happen to be. So here is what paragraph 1 might look like. It needs to explain some facts that would support interpretation A, and it needs to not talk about the provenance or the bias. So here we go. Interpretation A suggests that Liverpool are the best team in the Premier League and are going to win again this season. So it restates just briefly what the interpretation is saying. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because Liverpool have many internationally admired players in their squad, such as Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane, and they won the league comfortably last year, so they could be considered the best and likely to win again this season. So there's no mention of my bias, there's no mention of provenance, and it is just sticking to the facts. So it is true that Salah and Mane are internationally admired, and it's true that Liverpool won the league last year comfortably. So you don't need to agree necessarily, but it is some ways that it could be considered convincing. We're not yet going to speak about less convincing. Over to paragraph 2, repeat the process again for interpretation B. So we start by restating what the interpretation thinks. Interpretation B suggests that Liverpool are a poor team with no chance of winning. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because Liverpool have many significant injuries in their squad at the moment and have had a terrible set of recent performances with many losses to teams lower than them in the league, so they could be considered unlikely to win the Premier League again this season. So this is a good paragraph because it does not mention provenance, it does not mention bias, it does not mention trustworthiness, anything like that. It only states facts. So it is true that Liverpool have got a lot of significant injuries in their squad at the moment, unfortunately. And it is true, much as it pains me to say it, that our recent performances have been terrible. So those are some facts that would say why that interpretation is convincing. Again, we're not yet saying how it could be unconvincing. We're going to save that to the conclusion. And then finally, we're going to go on to our conclusion then. So overall, interpretation B is more convincing than interpretation A, because although Liverpool did win the league last year, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be able to do it again. And the more recent evidence, such as their 4-1 defeat to rivals Manchester City, suggests they will not be able to win the league this season. So here is where we're finally going to say which argument is stronger according to the facts alone. So I've said here that Mr. Moore's interpretation is actually more convincing according to the facts that we know. I've still not brought in provenance. I've still not said that Mr. Moore is any more reliable than me, the author of interpretation A. I'm only sticking to the facts. So this is a strong answer. So let's go to a historical example now. We're going to use the Treaty of Versailles and we're going to use these two interpretations. So interpretation A is from Brockdorff-Rantzau, Germany's foreign minister and the negotiator for the Treaty of Versailles for Germany. And he is basically saying the treaty is extremely unfair and it forces Germany to give up its whole existence. He's been very dramatic about it. Then on the other side, we've got Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and he's saying there's got to be justice for the dead and wounded, and Germany has to pay for what it's done. So it's been much more positive about the Treaty of Versailles. So we're now being asked which interpretation is the most convincing. So we've got to think which interpretation is the most accurate to the facts that we know about. What are the facts that we know about that would match up to these interpretations? What should we avoid talking about? You may want to pause the video here and just jot down your ideas to each of those three questions. So you can take either view about which interpretation you think is most accurate here. In terms of facts you might want to get down, you could talk about the fact that it potentially did cause the rise of Hitler in the Second World War. You could talk about some of the specific, apparently harsh clauses in the treaty, such as the reparations payments or the acceptance of all war guilt. On the other side, you could talk about the damage that Germany caused to France and how, therefore, they needed to pay something as compensation. In terms of avoiding certain areas in this answer, you need to avoid talking about bias or provenance. So although Georges Clemenceau is biased because he's the French Prime Minister, and although Brockdorff-Rantzau is obviously biased because he's the negotiator for Germany, that's true, but it's irrelevant to this question. It can't get any marks on the convincing question because the convincing question is only about facts and accuracy. So here we go. This would be the structure. Ways that interpretation A can be considered convincing, ways that interpretation B can be considered convincing, and then the overall conclusion. So here is what paragraph 1 could look like. We're going to explain some facts that support the interpretation, and we're going to avoid talking about provenance or bias. Interpretation A suggests that the Treaty of Versailles was excessively harsh to Germany. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because Germany were forced to accept all blame for the First World War despite multiple countries taking part, and they were forced to pay a $6.6 billion in reparations at a time when they were already economically desperate and weak. This would make the idea that the treaty was too harsh convincing. So we've explained our points, we've used specific details like the 6.6 billion, and we haven't talked about provenance or bias. So it's a strong paragraph there. We have not yet started to talk about ways that this could be less convincing because we're saving that. We're keeping our powder dry until the conclusion, which is when we'll bring that in. Paragraph 2, same process again for interpretation B. Bring in some facts that we know, go to our knowledge of the Treaty of Versailles that supports interpretation B. Little spag error there, I've noticed. So that should be B on the box on the right. So let's have a look at this model answer. Interpretation B suggests that the Treaty of Versailles was reasonable and fair. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because although other countries took part, Germany was the most openly militaristic and did the most to provoke war. Additionally, they caused huge damage to France, and therefore the idea that the reparations payments and loss of land could be seen as fair is convincing. So we haven't talked about Clemenceau's biases, so that's good. We've stuck to only the facts. So it is true that Germany was the most openly militaristic, and it probably is true that they did the most to provoke war. It is certainly true that they caused huge damage to France. You might also notice we're using key vocabulary here. So militaristic is a really nice word to use. You could just say aggressive, but militaristic is more subject specific. It's more precise. Also reparations, you could say debt, but reparations again is more precise, more formal, and it's going to impress your examiner more. Then we've got the conclusion where we're going to explain which bullet is most convincing overall. We're still not going to mention provenance or bias. And we may now finally start to talk about which is more and which is less convincing. So here we go. Overall, interpretation A is more convincing than interpretation B about the Treaty of Versailles because the punishments to Germany, particularly the reparations debt, were a major cause of the rise of Hitler and the Second World War. They were harsh enough to an already devastated German population that the treaty caused a deep resentment, even taking into account that Germany bore more responsibility than others for the war. So we're finally now saying which one has got the edge, and we're arguing that it's interpretation A because of the fact that the resentment among the German population for the treaty, we know from our own knowledge, from our fact base, that that is one of the contributors to the rise of Hitler and the Second World War. So we're saying that interpretation A is more convincing based on the facts that we know. Okay, it is now time for your turn at this. So I'm going to give you one more historical example, one more question. I'll show you the paragraph structure again to remind you, and then you are going to pause the video. You're going to take 10 minutes. You're going to write your answer, and you're going to check it against my model answer. So these are the two interpretations. We'll just read through these so that we are clear on them. So interpretation A is from Bernard von Bülow, who was a friend of Kaiser Wilhelm II. He says, "It was both necessary and desirable for us to be so strong at sea that no sea power could attack us without risk. We built the battleships for the sake of our honor and dignity." So he's talking there about the Kaiser's naval laws, and he's basically saying the naval laws were fantastic. They allowed Germany some honor and dignity. Over to interpretation B. Now, I have to note that interpretation B is made up. It's a fictitious source from August Bebel, who was a genuine SPD leader, but it is something that's very plausible that they would have said at the time. This really was their attitude. So August Bebel said this: "The naval laws are nothing more than a way for the Kaiser to conquer nations too weak to resist us. It is a national disgrace that money is spent on them while workers in our factories starve." So August Bebel being much more negative about the naval laws, saying in fact that they're disgraceful and that the money spent on battleships should instead go on workers' wages. So our question then is, which is more convincing about the naval laws, A or B? Our structure is going to be paragraph 1, ways that A can be considered convincing. Paragraph 2, ways that B can be considered convincing. And paragraph 3, the conclusion, which is most convincing overall. You're going to pause the video in a minute and have a go. Before you do, have a look at the think box. So jot down, which one do you think is most accurate? What are the facts that you know about the naval laws that could help support both of these interpretations and say that they are convincing? And what are you going to avoid talking about? So just pause the video here, 10 minutes, have a go at this model answer, use the structure there, and then we'll come back and compare it to a model answer. Okay, here we go. Well done for your practice effort there. So paragraph 1, how is interpretation A convincing? We're going to need to bring in some facts that support interpretation A, and we need to avoid talking about the provenance. So we're not going to mention von Bülow at any point here. Interpretation A suggests that the naval laws were necessary for the pride and dignity of Germany. So we've restated what the interpretation is saying just briefly. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because Germany was far behind the rest of Europe in terms of its empire and especially its navy. Britain was far stronger than Germany in naval terms. This makes the view that the naval laws were necessary for Germany's dignity convincing. So we brought in some knowledge. Germany really was far behind the rest of Europe in terms of its navy and especially Britain. So you could say that it's convincing that there's a lack of dignity in that and that they needed to build more ships. No mention here of the provenance or bias, so that's good. Paragraph 2, we do the same process again for interpretation B. So interpretation B suggests that the naval laws were a disgraceful waste of money. From my own knowledge, I can see that this is convincing because the Kaiser had to borrow enormous amounts of money to pay for the new battleships, and he did so at a time when German workers in the factories were being paid very little and enduring very harsh conditions in their workplaces. Therefore, the view that the naval laws were a waste of money can be seen as convincing. So again, no mention of bias, although August Bebel certainly would be biased as a socialist that believes in advancing the working class. That's not relevant here. We only want to talk about facts. And it is true, a fact that we've mentioned here that's true, is the Kaiser did have to borrow a lot of money to pay for the battleships, and workers really were being paid poorly and enduring harsh conditions in the factories. So that would support the idea that the naval laws were unfair and that a better use of money would be for them to go on wages. Finally, we need to say which one is more convincing than the other. So far we've said how both are convincing, and we've resisted the temptation to talk about how they're less convincing because we're saving it for the conclusion. And so we're now going to explain that. Overall, interpretation A is more convincing than interpretation B about the naval laws because although Germany did lag behind Britain in the numbers of battleships they owned, there is no clear reason why they must possess more, and paying deprived workers a reasonable wage can be argued to be a more pressing priority. So we're saying here that although it's true that Germany lagged behind, a more pressing priority, a bigger need for Germany should have been to pay its own workers a reasonable wage so that they're not suffering terribly before they go on to constructing battleships. There's still no talk about provenance or bias because you can't get any marks for provenance or bias in this question. So have a little check at your answer, see how it compares to this one, see if you've avoided the most common traps, and give yourself an overall mark on that. So we come to the end of the lesson now. Well done for your effort. This is the hardest question, so feel free to watch this video as many times as you want to get used to it. Practice lots of different versions of it and you will crack it. Just a reminder of where we've been. We've been trying to figure out how do we get 8 out of 8, 100% on the Germany 8-mark convincing question, the hardest one in this paper. To do that, we've explained how each interpretation is accurate and not how it is reliable or unreliable. We've stuck to only the facts. The structure we've used has been interpretation A, interpretation B, and then conclusion. We have not talked, this is the last time I promise, we have not talked about bias or the provenance. We've been nice and disciplined. And we've stuck to just the positives, just the ways that the interpretations are convincing until we've reached our conclusion where we've explained which one has the edge. Well done for sticking with it this far, guys, and good luck with the rest of your course.